thank you for having me. I'm really delighted to be here. So we're going to just go right into this talk. And my talk today is drawn from my book, Firsting and Lasting, Writing Indians Out of Existence in New England, which is in turn based on a close analysis of some 600 texts published about localities in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island between 1820 and 1880. I want to begin with a story that I hope will lay out the larger argument of my book, which really talks about the material in these volumes about Native people, which about 2/3 of them contained that. And then, so I'll begin with the story, and then I'll turn to some of the ideas that help me make sense of this large body of material. I also want to suggest that even though my book centers on Southern New England, that's where I did the research, I think it has strong resonance with Northern New England as well, but you all can be the judges of that. So the story. On June 3rd, 1856, Emory Washburn, educated in the law at Harvard and fresh off a brief term as governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, stood to address the people of Bridgewater, Massachusetts on the 200th anniversary of its legal incorporation. They were gathered, he proclaimed, to lay the offerings of cherished memories and honest pride upon altars which our fathers reared here in years that are past, unquote. Washburn's account participated in a robust tradition of Southern New England ancestor worship, and it grounded that story locally. The original inhabitants of the land that became Bridgewater barely registered in his address, although the way they did turn up is telling. Their first mention came when he named the committee that was appointed, quote, to obtain the requisite title deeds from the good old Massasoit with whose jurisdiction this territory was situated, unquote. He went on to note, tradition points out the spot where this act of purchase was completed, which once bore the name of Sachem's Rock. But it is sad to think of all the race who then peopled this region, nothing but tradition now remains. It is sad to recall in how short a time, not a drop of blood of the Sachem of Pokanoket, whose hand of friendship welcomed our fathers to these shores, was to be found in the veins of any living being. Slide. After having turned over legal possession of their lands to the newcomers, Indians receded from the scene in Washburn's account. Indians, he asserted, had so thoroughly vanished from the region that not even one drop of blood survived in any living person. Mournful though it may be, Bridgewater people would have to settle for place names and traditions when it came to knowing about the Indians their ancestors encountered. We can only imagine how the Indians who remained in their southern New England homelands might have received this sweeping claim. In spite of more than 2 centuries of English colonialism that worked to displace them and make them disappear, New England Indians remained in their homelands. We know that they were there because of a report produced by John Milton Earl, who served as Commissioner of Indian Affairs in the 1850s, that enumerated Indian families and communities throughout Massachusetts. We know that they were there because Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island maintained bureaucracies for Indian affairs at the time he was writing that offered additional archival evidence. We know that they were there because their descendants are still there. How could Emory Washburn have overlooked them? How could he have failed to know the larger and far more complicated story of Indian survival? These are not trivial questions. They get to the heart of crucial aspects of the racial dynamics of Southern New England and indeed in the United States. The text that contained Washburn's historical account was one of hundreds that participated in the larger ideological project that my book takes up. My aim is to understand how non-Indians in Southern New England convinced themselves that Indians there had become extinct, even though they remained and remain as Indian peoples to this day. I argue that these processes can be best understood by getting at the mindset of ordinary non-Indians. And I try to get at that mindset by analyzing the historical narratives non-Indians told about Indians. No local narrators in complex ways wrote Indians out of existence, I argue. I try to make sense of this process by developing the concepts of firsting and lasting, ideas I'll try to explain today. Why did local narrators tell Indian stories at all when relations of power would have permitted them to entirely elide Indian history? I argue that New Englanders embraced Indians because doing so enabled them to establish unambiguously their own modernity. Non-Indians narrated their own present against what they considered as a backdrop of a past symbolized by Indian peoples in their cultures. The master narrative of New England was that it had made a stark break with the past, replacing uncivilized peoples whose histories and cultures they represented as illogically rooted in nature, tradition, and superstition whereas New Englanders symbolized the civilized order of culture, science, and reason. Modernity is predicated on exactly this sort of rupture. Within this rubric, the narration of Indian extinction in local texts, I argue, proceeded along two important avenues. Insistence on the idea of blood purity as a central criterion of authentic Indianness reflected importantly the scientific racism that prevailed in the 19th century. New England Indians had intermarried, including with African Americans, for many decades, and their failure to comply with non-Indian ideas about Indian phenotype strained the credence for their Indianness in New English minds. This penchant for Indian purity as authenticity also found expression in the idea of the ancient. Non-Indians refused to regard culture change as normative for Indian peoples. Thus, while Indians adapted to the changes wrought by colonialism by selectively embracing new ways and ideas, such transformations stretched beyond the imagination of New Englanders. Indians could only be ancients, and refusal to behave as such rendered Indians inauthentic in their minds. Indians, then, can never be modern. These ideas provided fertile ground for the idea of Indian extinction, a mythology that obliterated the fact of Indian survival and fostered the dominant ideology about racial formation in 19th century New England and informed a developing national ideology about Indians. In the process of asserting their modernity, local writers worked mightily to root the new English social order deeply. In effect, they claimed to be the first people who established cultures and institutions worthy of notice, thereby subtly declaring the invalidity of Indian ways of life. Indians served the larger storyline of establishing the primacy of the New English social order. Collectively, the effect of their ideological labor is to appropriate the category indigenous away from Indians and for themselves. They subtly argue for the sole legitimacy of New English ways, as the institutions and practices of non-Indians are posited as the epitome of modernity. What I want to do now is turn to the central arguments of each of the 4 chapters of my book, but with particular emphasis on the concepts of firsting and lasting, and offer some illustrations, both narrative and graphic, of these ideas. I begin the book with firsting. Local texts claim Indian places as their own. How so? And you might be asking yourself, what is firsting and how does it work? Plymouth, Massachusetts offers us the quintessential evidence, as is beautifully illustrated in James Thatcher's History of the Town of Plymouth from its first settlement in 1620 to the present time, with a concise history of the Aborigines of New England and their wars with the English, etc. As the place that could make a generally accepted claim about the primacy in the permanent establishment of New England, Plymouth could boast a plethora of firsts vis-a-vis any other New English place. Some of these firsts could be unique to Plymouth. Where else could a contest ensue over whose was the first foot of the first white person to land in the first permanent English settlement in New England? Descendants of John Alden and Mary Chilton quarreled over the distinction in the 19th century. Thank goodness they did so in print for my book. Thatcher's volume detailed the dramatic event of the first landing and went on to claim that this is then to be considered the first stepping on the rock of the pilgrims from the shallop belonging to the Mayflower, and this is the birthday of our nation, unquote. A claim that certainly might have been contested and was by Jamestown, 1607, for those of you who are keeping score. Plymouth too could claim the first English child born in New England and could muse over the March 16, 1621 encounter with Samoset, who purportedly greeted the new arrivals, quote, cheeringly in broken English, welcome Englishmen, unquote. Samoset repeatedly learned some English from fishermen in what was to be renamed Maine, which calls into question the possibility that this encounter was all that novel. Thatcher tells us this was the first savage with whom the whites had obtained an interview, unquote, at least in Plymouth. Less amiable encounters ensued later, yet peace with the Indians came to prevail. A map of Plymouth Village in 1832 forms the frontispiece to this volume, on which Watson's Hill is depicted as the place where the first Indian treaty was made, about which more in a moment. Next slide, please. The stone arch bridge was erected over the town brook in the year 1812 at Spring Hill, precisely at the spot where the colonists had their first interview with Massasoit in 1621. The hill where the sachem with his train of 60 men appeared was called Strawberry Hill by the first planters, now Watson's Hill, unquote. Other firsts noted by Thatcher included the first Sabbath, first English town built in New England, first offense committed and punished, first prison, first marriage ever solemnized in New England, first record of horses, first division of lands, first church, first pastor of the first church, and the first mention of a wharf. You get the idea. Note that many of these firsts, such as marriages and births and churches, could be customized by locality and replicated across the landscape of New England, so other places could participate in the robust practice of firsting, and they were. But what were they doing? All of these firsts relate in one way or to another to the establishment of institutions New Englanders regarded as central to their identity and as essential elements in the modernity of their social order, whether it be institutionalized religious practice, the implementation of legal codes governing everything from marriage to civil and criminal offenses, economic development, or political establishments. New Englanders scripted themselves as modern people looking to the future, creating order out of chaos and forging modern societies and cultures that broke from the past. This story implicitly argues that Indians and Indian ways could not be acknowledged as legitimate, ongoing, and part of the landscape of the future. And now I want to look at a few illustrations. So the next slide, please. Just kind of look at how this looks. Here is a book, The History of Ridgefield, Connecticut, from its first settlement to the present time by Daniel Teller, published in 1878. And this gives you an idea what these books look like. I'm sure probably many of you looked at books like this. There's a couple of things I find notable about this particular illustration. First, you see the frontispiece is this framed house, which is making a claim, right, about what modernity looks like. And one of the things I see that's interesting here is you see at the top, it says President Northrup's Library. Who was President Northrop? Well, he was the president of the University of Minnesota. And I got this book out of our own library. So what I'm trying to say is these books are circulating everywhere. And so is this message that I'm talking about in firsting and lasting. Next slide. Here we have an illustration of what is claimed to be the first congregational meeting house of Natick, Massachusetts. And I'm here to tell you that it's not. In fact, the first congregational meeting house of Natick, Massachusetts was constructed entirely by Indigenous people in the 1650s. So this is just a flagrant erasure of Indian history right here. Next slide. Here, I love this illustration, the first washing day at Cape Cod, that can be found in a history of Plymouth, Massachusetts. What are you supposed to make of this image? You see the Mayflower off in the background, and then you see these pilgrims here in these stereotypical depictions, where the first thing it seems that they decided they needed to do when they landed on shore was do laundry, and also that the men needed to guard them, presumably from Indians, right? It's conveying all kinds of layered meanings. And then the next one is a really common kind of image from the same book. You'll see the illustration is the same. So next one, Vera. The first Thanksgiving, where we see pilgrims and Indians gathering together for this mythological event. Next slide. So these bold non-Indian claims about their own historicity implicitly stand in contrast to Indians. Non-Indians could not credit Indians with originating history and properly claiming these places. An historian of Manchester, Massachusetts, brought Indians explicitly into the picture and rooted his originary claims to the idea of how history is made. I'm quoting, "The history of America begins with the advent of Europeans in the New World. The red men in small and scattered bands roamed the stately forests and interminable prairies, hunted the bison and the deer, fished the lakes and streams, gathered around the council fire, and danced the war dance. But they planted no states, founded no commerce, cultivated no arts, built no civilizations. They made no history," unquote. And in Lynn, the history of the red men remains in impenetrable obscurity. They had no books to contain their laws, exhibit their polity, or record their achievements, no written language, unquote. Both of these constructions conjured up the stereotype of lazy, wandering, ignorant Indians living in lawless chaos and confusion without a written language with which to record their feats on a land they could not truly claim to own. According to this calculus, Indian people did not make history and therefore could not become the foundations of modern nations. These notions about origins called into being a peculiar phenomenon that I call famous first Indians. Originary places such as Plymouth depended on famous first Indians to authorize their origins and inaugurate the production of modernity in New England. Plainly, the only thing that makes these Indians firsts is their role in a narrative whereby they are to be replaced. Here's where famous first Indians depart dramatically from their non-Indian counterparts. Rather than gaining their fame as firsts who will be part of an enduring modernity, they are famous because they set into motion the processes that are the beginning of their end. Most notable in this respect are Indian leaders who entered into diplomatic relationships with the English, thus authorizing the English presence in Indian homelands. Even though part of the non-Indian claim to Indian places rested in the argument that Indians made no history, in their depiction of famous first Indians, we learned that they did do diplomacy, and they did so in order to legitimate the English presence. Thus, local histories enshrined iconic Indian figures in their stories of origins, none more so than the trio of Samoset, Massasoit, and Squanto. The life stories of these individuals signify a particular story of colonialism. We learned that on the 16th of March, 1621, quote, much surprise was excited by the appearance of an Indian who boldly walked into the rendezvous and cried out cheeringly in broken English, welcome Englishmen, welcome Englishmen. This was Samoset, a Sagamore who had come from Monhegan, district of Maine, where he had learned something of the English tongue from the captains of the fishing vessels on that shore, and he knew by name most of the commanders. This was the first savage with whom the whites had obtained an interview. No incident could have diffused greater joy in the hearts of the disconsolate. He said that the place they now occupy is called Patuxet, and that about 4 years ago all the natives died of an extraordinary plague, that there was neither woman, man, nor child remaining in the territory of which the English had now possessed themselves, unquote. The remarkable providence of an Indian hailing the English in English, however halting, bode well for the English. Intermittent visits and exchanges with other Indians ensued after this first interview, which paved the way for something much more momentous. Samoset returned on April 9th with other Indians, including Squanto, cast as the only surviving native of Patuxet, and Massasoit in tow. They came with overtures for trade and peace extended by each side. With military precautions also taken on each side, Captain Miles Standish guided Massasoit with a contingent of his group to Governor Carver, after which a treaty was negotiated. One historian neatly summarized the results of these negotiations. With him, meaning Massasoit, their first treaty was concluded. In an unfinished building near Plymouth, the floor was spread with a rug and a cushion to give dignity to the proceedings, were conducted the simple negotiations which are memorable as the beginning of American diplomacy. The treaty was one of alliance, not of subjection. He lived to see his territories melt away before the steady inroads of the whites, but he remained to the last true to the compact he had made, unquote. Even before a proper building could be finished to dignify the negotiations, the English entered into a treaty of alliance, not subjugation, with the Indians. Thus did the trio of Samoset, Squanto, and Massasoit set into motion the grand tradition of American diplomacy and set the stage for more than 50 years of peaceful relations, horribly violated by Massasoit's own son, King Philip. And in this single family, Plymouth scripted both the noble and the ignoble savage, the excellent and friendly Massasoit, whose dignified commitment to amiable interaction in exchange was destined to be betrayed by his ignoble son. Famous first Indians signify essential elements in the project of modernity. Iconic Indians are meant to project the notion of a pacifist colonialism in which friendly Indians invited the English to settle among them. The English reject the medieval order of aristocracy and land grants from kings in favor of a new American diplomacy that involved negotiations with Indians for the peaceful occupation of their homelands. First Indians gain their fame by authorizing these transactions. Their ancestors then give way to the processes of replacement in their homelands through the production of modernity. The end product of firsting, then, is the mounting of the argument that Indian peoples and their cultures represented an inauthentic and prefatory history. The New English break from the traditional world of Indians made possible the insidious claim that New England erected the first houses, institutions, polities, and economies, the first social order in the modern world. In this construct, even when local narrators took note of Indian peoples, villages, cultures, politics, economies, and economies, and religion, they did not represent a rational and thus authentic ordering of the social order. By their persistent arguing for a prefatory history of Indian history of New England, local narrators participated in a seizure of indigeneity away from Indians and for themselves. This seizure, in turn, depended upon an insistence that incompatible Indian people had disappeared or would do so in the near future. I look at the way local texts consolidated these claims in my second chapter, which is called Replacing. Historical practices argue that non-Indians have supplanted Indians. Local narrators substituted one, Indian history, with another, their own, sometimes collapsing the story in a few terse yet evocative phrases, such as the following. The dark, tangled forests have gone. The wild beasts which prowled there for prey are gone likewise. The Indians with their canoes, wigwams, council fires, and terrific war whoops have also disappeared. And in their place we have fertile fields, smiling gardens, tasteful, commodious dwellings, a civilized community, and the temples of the living God. The locality is the same. Time, culture, and science alone have wrought the transformation, unquote. This stark rendering of history argues for a rupture. Indians, cast as anonymous savage denizens of the forest, have been replaced by God-fearing farmers who have tamed the wilderness and erected frame buildings that composed civilized communities. The lengthy, complex, and contested history of Indian relations is dispensed with in a series of sweeping assertions that dismiss Indians as long gone, replaced by non-Indians who are making modernity. Scripts such as these serve as what I call replacement narratives. Local texts both narrated a process by which non-Indians replaced Indians in their homelands and attested to a wide range of cultural practices that contributed to the larger message of replacement, namely, in the erection of historical monuments, mounting of historical commemorations, the excavation of alien Indian relics, selective retention of place names, and in the land itself. Ideas surrounding these acts of memory and placemaking participate in the production and reproduction of assumptions about Indians, New England, and modernity, and they constitute an implicit argument of replacement. And here's some more illustrations of this. So next slide. Here's a monument to the Narragansett leader Miantanomo, erected in 1841. It's really a monument that is to his demise at the hands of, next slide, the Mohican sachem Uncas, who engaged in a war with him in 1643. And here you see this monument to Uncas, and really also to him as kind of the last, signifying the last significant leader. Here, I just want to point out the base of this monument in all of these ironies that happen, or not ironies really, was dedicated in 1833, right in the middle of the removal crisis, and Andrew Jackson was actually there in attendance for that. The next slide. Here's a monument erected to Massasoit in Warren, Rhode Island, his birthplace, in the place of his home village in the early 20th century. It took years to raise the money to actually erect this plaque on this boulder. Next slide. Here we have this statue, this monument to Massasoit that I write about with Lisa Blee in my most recent monograph in Plymouth, Massachusetts. And of course, this is the famous first Indian that I just wrote about, the Wampanoag leader. Next slide. Here is a proposed monument to John Eliot, the missionary to Indians. And I find this illustration just fascinating. It comes from a book called Sketches of the Life of the Apostle Eliot, prefatory to the subscription for erecting a monument to his memory. So they're trying to raise money to erect this proposed monument. And what I find remarkable here is you have the plaque, Eliot, Apostle to the Indians here. You have this proposed monument fenced off, and what do you have here? A tiny, diminutive Indian in furs and with bows and arrows and feathers pointing up to this monument. Okay, and let's see, I think a couple more. So here you have an illustration of one of these commemorations I mentioned earlier in Norwich, Connecticut, these throngs of people who returned to community to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the founding or legal incorporation of towns. And one of the things that happens at these events is there's these long historical orations that go on and on and on. And here people are delivered the message of Indian erasure, the replacement narrative I'm talking about. So it gets disseminated in all of these different kinds of ways. I think there's one more. Or no, there's a couple more actually still. So next slide. Here's another illustration of the bicentennial dinner at Norwich. Next. Here is something that is narrated at the bottom, the caption, as an Indian map of Glastonbury, Connecticut. Well, no, it's not, obviously. It's on the printed page, and it is a map that engages in this selective renaming process that I was talking about earlier. So you have the selective retention of indigenous names that give an American and local flavor to this place, but also things like Salmon River at the bottom, right? Next slide. Here we have, we every once in a while get the reproduction and facsimile of a deed. So here's a deed complete with Indian marks on it to Agawam, which became Springfield, Massachusetts. And one of the things that's being conveyed here is the legality of the English presence, right? The legality of English colonialism. Springfield was purchased lawfully, is the message here in this illustration of Agawam. Next. Here we have a map illustrative of the Indian purchases of ancient Windsor, Connecticut. One of the things that I like about this map, first of all, it's got the Indian mark again at the bottom, but it shows here a claim where, as you know, in New England, everything's part of a town, right? But this is conveying not 1 square inch of New England was obtained in anything but a lawful means. Next slide. Here we have the cover of my book, Firsting and Lasting, which is drawn from the next illustration. I wanted this so bad for the cover of my book, and then the designers tweaked with it. It's the illustration, Black William selling Nahant to Thomas Dexter for a suit of clothes. This is from A History of Lynn, Massachusetts. And what are you supposed to get from this? That Indians gave away the land for trinkets, right? That whole message of Indians didn't really want the land as part of that replacement narrative. Okay, so moving forward, in my third chapter, which is called Lasting, Texts Purify the Landscape of Indians by Denying Them a Place in Modernity, I show how historical narration implicitly argued that Indians can never be modern because they cannot be the subject of change, only its victims. This discourse locates Indians in the dim mists of the past, suggesting that culture change and racial mixing, what they call racial mixing, makes Indians into Indian descendants rather than authentic Indians. Conversely, non-Indian New Englanders reserved to themselves the authorship of recorded time, which is subject to a progress narrative wherein racial mixing and cultural dynamism are asserted as the privilege of whiteness. I call this racial rubric the temporalities of race. This is a way of thinking about race in relation to time. Most basically, the idea that Indians cannot change and still be considered authentic Indians. In contrast, non-Indians, by definition, are dynamic and always changing. This rubric found dramatic expression in the phenomenon of what I call lasting, a rhetorical strategy that asserts the claim that Indians can never be modern as a fact. The practice of lasting helped produce a narrative of progress in historical time for non-Indians, mixture and degeneracy for Indians. It might be seen as juxtaposed with the notion of indelible pollution for African Americans, the one-drop rule. In these ways, the very practice of historical writing participates in the creation of these temporalities of race. An essential location for lasting is to be found in the complex discourse surrounding blood in these narratives, most starkly in stories about the last full-blooded Indian, to which I now turn. Squanto was the first last Indian, but he was decidedly not the last. Famously representing the peaceful embrace of the English in 1620, Squanto had returned to his homeland following years of slavery in Spain at the hands of Englishman Captain Thomas Hunt. He arrived only to find his village had vanished in the wake of the devastating epidemic of 1616 to 1619 that had providentially paved the way for English colonialism. Quote, on the arrival of the Pilgrims at Plymouth in 1620, they found their lot cast with the limits of a deserted Indian country. Of the name of the tribe that inhabited that section, its history, or the cause of its departure, they knew absolutely nothing, unquote. Squanto, claimed to be the sole remaining native of Pawtuxet, turned up shortly and embarked upon his career as one of the most famous go-betweens in Indian America, or so the story goes. Although dwarfed in importance by the welcoming diplomat Massasoit in 19th century accounts, Squanto attained the status of icon in the 20th century as a symbol for virgin land available for the taking and the imminent demise of Indian people who had once claimed this land as their homeland. What might be thought of as the squanto motif of lasting found fertile ground in the imaginations of 19th century New Englanders, and authors frequently extrapolated its claims across the landscape. And the assertion of lastness took many forms. Some modified their claims by including the locality or tribe of whom they are purported to be the last. Some last Indians, such as Charles Josias, signified the demise of Indians not long after the arrival of the English in the 17th century. He is claimed as the last Indian of Bridgewater, Duxbury, and Roxbury. Likewise, in an address delivered before the Massachusetts Society of Colonial Dames, an historian featured the 17th century Pawtucket Wanalancet as, quote, the last of the sachems of the Merrimack River Indians, unquote. While this assertion does not explicitly argue for extinction, it does suggest the demise of Indian autonomy in claiming the end of an Indian polity and way of life. But many other accounts scripted their last Indians as solitary and presumably lonely survivors who somehow managed to maneuver the tricky shoals of English colonialism and find their way into the 19th century, only then to succumb to the inevitable process of replacement. At least one last Indian in New England preceded the famous Last of the Mohegans conjured into extinction by James Fenimore Cooper in his 1826 novel. An 1821 history of Bradford, Massachusetts, concluded its account of what was possibly a considerable settlement of Indians by informing the readers that the last of these who resided here was Papa Hannah, who lived to a great age in a hut near the mouth of Johnson's Creek. The people of the last generation knew him well, unquote. The rich theme of lasting found its place in a broad canvas of cultural expression in the 19th century. The message echoed in historical writing, poetry, theatrical production, portraiture, and other venues. Martha Simons became one of the most famous last Indians of New England. Next slide, please, Vera. According to the historian Daniel Ricketson, during the middle and even to the latter part of the last century, a few of the lingering remnants of the once noble possessors of this soil remained, retaining to their ancient form of habitation, the wigwam or hut, unquote. He claimed that only Martha Simons remained when he wrote his history in the 1850s, residing in Dartmouth, Massachusetts, as, quote, one solitary specimen of a full-blooded native. She is the last of her race, unquote. Her fame attracted the luminary Henry David Thoreau to drop in on Martha Simons, whom he called the last full-blooded Indian of New Bedford. He paid her a visit in 1856 and recorded this observation in his journals. To judge from her physiognomy, she might have been King Philip's own daughter. Yet she could not speak Indian and knew nothing of her race, unquote. And Martha Simons' fame in the middle of the 19th century also inspired the well-known artist Albert Bierstadt to paint her portrait in 1857, which he entitled Martha Simons, the Last of the Narragansetts. And this is the portrait that you're looking at right now. Bierstadt's claim that she represented the last Narragansett in the 1850s is undone in 1879 in William Cullen Bryant and Sidney Gay's A Popular History of the United States that features then still living Esther Kenyon as the last of the royal Narragansetts. But that she receives such attention underscores not just Indian fascination with the idea of Indian demise, but also their obsession with the modern project of purification. So another couple slides. The next one, please, Vera. Here's an illustration of Eunice Maui, who we can see in lots of illustrations in different publications in the 19th century as a last Indian, often scripted as female, but not always. So the next illustration counters that. Here's Abraham Corey of Nantucket. And this illustration is just so rich, I think. Here he is looking very forlorn, right, in his cabin, wearing a suit and tie, but he's barefoot. You can see his shoes are in the background. And you see at his feet are flowers in baskets, and also on the table, implying he's a basket maker. And if you look through the window, you can see industrialization in the background. The implication here is he's about to be done with, right? So compare these constructs to the embrace of all non-Indians who could draw any connection to the town of Hadley, Massachusetts during its 200th anniversary. Quote, the large hospitalities of the occasion rightly embrace and welcome all who by descent or intermarriage, by blood or residence, from far or near are related not merely to the geographic, but to the human Hadley of 200 years ago. New England Indians could never expect such expansive definitions of inclusiveness of their own communities to pass muster with non-Indian New Englanders. The construct relied upon the application of completely opposite criteria for establishing race. In the case of white New Englanders, the possession of any drop of Puritan blood enabled one to claim membership in that special category, and the problem of purity of blood was elided. In the case of Indians, any admixture with any other blood diminished their Indianness in the English imaginary, and mixing banned Indian claims to their identity. Quote, "There are none of unmixed blood remaining in my native town today. Half-breed and quarter-breeds gain a precarious living by fishing or picking cranberries in the bogs around Ponkapog Pond, but the Aborigines of 2 centuries ago have departed and forever," unquote. In effect, what such claims about New Englishness assert is an implicit one-drop rule for themselves. Any claim to a drop of New English or Puritan blood, any vague connection one could make to the Puritan fathers, entitled the claimant to membership in the New English race, a race that is asserted as pure, even while it is acknowledged by many to be foreign in mixture. The vagueness of these claims might be fruitfully put alongside the vagueness of lasting claims made about Indians as they move in completely opposite directions. And this fascinating parallel to the one-drop rule for African Americans, which relegated them to a pollution narrative and that subjects them to slavery and racial discrimination, should a claim of even a single drop of African blood be asserted, must also be contrasted to New English requirements for Indianness. In that construct, any mixture of Indian blood with any other blood renders the individual less Indian until the possibility of acknowledging the Indianness of New England Indians vanishes in the New English imaginary. What we have here, then, is a theory of racial purity built on the fact of impurity that is used to call into question the Indianness of people in the present and their likelihood to survive as peoples in the future. The temporality of race insisted Indians remained mired in a static past, blinded New Englanders to an important fact. Indians resisted their effacement for New England in the 19th century by embracing change in order to make their way in a changing world, as they had done for centuries. This is the argument of my final chapter, which is called Resisting. Claims and texts about Indian extinction fail even as they are being made. Their ongoing resistance to settler colonialism took multiple forms and translated into their survival as Indian peoples. Driven to understand Indianness through a degeneration narrative about race that insisted upon blood purity and coupled with an understanding of Indians reckoned within the temporalities of race, non-Indians have failed to accord Indian peoples a legitimate place in modernity. They failed to recognize New England Indian as modern peoples who looked to the future and instead constructed a pervasive myth of Indian extinction. Why did New Englanders have such trouble recognizing New England Indians as such? On one level, their assumptions about Indians were shaped by the temporalities of race that preconditioned them to understand Indians through this degeneration narrative. But on another level, they refused to recognize them because it was useful not to. Recognizing Indians entailed fulfilling obligations to them with regard to protecting their lands and other resources and attending to their needs under the system of guardianship, a trust relationship that had organically developed under more than 200 years of colonialism. It also stood in the way of the modernizing project of purification that was so preoccupied with completion. No one personified the engagement with modernity more publicly than the Pequot minister, activist, and public intellectual William Apis, who you're looking at right now, author of 5 published books in his short but eventful life. Apis's vision, articulated in his writings, obliterates the idea that lay at the center of the New England project of nationalism, which argued for the primacy of a new modern social order they claimed as their hallmark to the exclusion of the ongoing existence of Indian nations. He rejects this construct by insisting on the equality and integrity of Indian peoples, natives of the land, and the fact of Indian survival and endurance into the future. He reclaims indigeneity from non-Indians who attempted to seize it through their construct of modernity. New England history is Indian history, he argues, and Indian people continue to resist the audacious colonialism inaugurated by those who stumbled onto Plymouth Rock. Along the way, he exposes the racism honed in the colonial encounter that New England Indians were forced to live with in the present. He told of personal stories with prejudice in Connecticut, quote, where they are so pious that they kill the cats for killing rats and whip the beer barrels for working upon the Sabbath, unquote. Such false piety could be found at the center of the colonial project, the ideological framework for the replacement narrative, succinctly stated by Apis himself, quote, And the seed of iniquity and prejudice was sown in that day, and so it still remains. There is a deep-rooted popular opinion in the hearts of many that Indians were made on purpose for destruction, to be driven out by white Christians, and they to take their place, unquote. Apus's activism, publications, and public appearances are in and of themselves stunning acts of resistance. The story he tells challenges the notion of a natural break with ancient superstitions that clear the way for modernity and points out the violence of that claim. Rather, he emphasizes the habits of superstition and myth-making non-Indians engaged in through their peculiar mode of commemoration that purported to make Indians disappear, a mode he takes up to offer a counter-narrative to English claims in his tour de force, a eulogy on King Philip. Apus's other writings speak to the ongoing vibrancy of Indian peoples in New England, even as they struggled within the colonial regime. Indians appear as modern people forging their own dignified lives into the future in spite of the horrors that accompanied their treatment as racial others. His autobiography tells a profound story of Indian survival and resistance that resonates with the longer narrative of dispossession and colonialism in New England. We can draw larger implications about Indian history and survival from the writings of William Apus and others, in concert with the evidence of the rich and eventful lives of 19th century New England Indians, which undoes the project of purification in the service of modernity. His writings and the proliferating new scholarship that is bringing 19th century and beyond New England history to a modern audience allows us to read the official record in a far more nuanced way, and to recognize more fully the ways that New England Indian peoples have always claimed New England as theirs. Apus's eloquent testimony notwithstanding, non-Indian New Englanders had other ideas. During the 19th century, and in dialogue with debates over abolition, citizenship, and racial equality, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island all took measures to officially terminate their recognition of the political status of the New England Indian peoples. This debate took place using the discourse of extending citizenship and or detribalizing Indians for incorporation of them on an equal basis with all others. In effect, New England pursues what I'll call termination to eliminate the claims that can be made by Indians by virtue of being nations, such as the protection of Indian homelands and resources. Individual Indians could remain and be recognized as individuals. Such actions, in effect, removed Indian survivors, usually cast as colored or mixed or Black, from a surviving nationhood recognized by the state, and subjected them to a narrative that insisted Indian populations were degenerate and disappearing. As everyone present for this talk knows, the constructs I have been discussing today cannot possibly account for the present-day realities of Indian New England. For the past several decades, just like the centuries that preceded them, New England Indians resisted their effacement, struggling and frequently succeeding to force the United States to recognize the nation-to-nation relationship that is at the heart of Indian sovereignty in the US. Whether they have yet succeeded or not, they continue to remake themselves as Indian peoples in their homelands and in modernity. More than 500 years of Indian resistance to colonialism suggests this struggle will not end. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Jean. That was a really critical analysis of our New England history and what's been going on for a long time. And I'm hoping maybe we might be able to answer some audience questions. I see some applause coming in through emojis. And if you have any questions for Jean, you can drop them into the chat box and we can read them out loud. We did have a comment come in earlier that says, I'm sorry, I'm not good enough with names. I thought King Philip was the last to rule by Mountain Lake and Lowland Pool. And I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Well, so King Philip is scripted as the last leader, right? And I mean, when I started reading about New England history back a long, long time ago in graduate school, all the historical narratives came to the conclusion that New England Indians became extinct with King Philip's War, with the end of that war, which we all know is not true. And so he attained this fame as this person who gave this last mighty but failed resistance to Indian survival in New England, right? And at that point, Indigenous peoples go underground in the narratives. I mean, they retain their families, their kinship connections, their communities, their tribal entities under the surface of all these narratives where English colonialism wants them to disappear, right? And so that's the narrative that has been written into existence. And it is about writing Indians out of existence. So, it's just, that's the scripting. And we all know very well that Indian leadership structures, so he's not the last leader at all, continue in ways that English people don't take account of. I think personally that very much the reason that happens is because of land seizure. So English colonists are very, very much interested in understanding Indian people and negotiating with them as long as there's land to be that they can dispossess Indians of. So that's the mythology. We know different today, right? I hope. And not enough people know differently today. And many of your non-native neighbors don't know well enough that that's not the case. I hope that answered the question.
I think so. And I think that's why these conversations are so critical. And I'm so excited that you've been coming into the New England region and doing this talk. One person in the audience says the way that life cycle works, they have never left and are coming back now. The hologram is turning as the sun and planets shine on us. Thank you so much for your work. And that makes sense. It was a little old book. And many, many thanks coming in. So much great information. Willie Winnie, thank you for this. Thank you for making us aware of these roots. Here's a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
So what is to be done now?
What is to be done now? Oh, that is such a hard question, right? I think one of the things that is to be not done now is that Indigenous people in New England are and need to be seizing control of the historical narrative, right? And narrating what this history really is about, and that Indigenous people continue to live and thrive in their homelands in New England. What happens beyond that is really complicated, right? There's a very complicated terrain of recognition politics that are really slippery and difficult and highly local. So that's another plan in which all of these things are playing out continuously into the present and into the future. And there's a lot. There's the Abenaki Artists Association. There's tribal museums. There's all kinds of great cultural and historical work happening within tribal nations. So I think those are the things I look to as an historian and as an Indigenous historian, actually working outside of my homelands. Now my new work is actually turning back home finally. So I kind of accidentally ended up working on New England, thinking I was going to do Ojibwe history. And now I'm turning back home finally after 40 years.
It's nice that you can bring your work back home though, right?
Yes, I'm excited to do that.
So Cheryl is asking, I was curious why your choice using their, in quotes, language, Indians, New England, in your talk's title.
That's a good question. I take it up because I'm taking their language and showing what they're doing with it, I guess, would be the best answer to that question. I also would say, I published this book now 12 years ago. I can't believe it. Time flies. At that time, we were using this language, right? I think if I were to write this or rewrite this book today, I would probably use the term Indigenous and or Native, and probably not use Indian much unless I was quoting texts. So I think we're constantly learning more about each other. In our present moment, we're learning more about Indigenous people globally, which is a really great thing. And so these terrains are always shifting. So I mean, you can take a book like Lisa Brooks' Our Beloved Kin, which is such a beautiful book. And she's so situated in New England and in the language, and she can write that book at this moment now, 2 years ago, whatever it is, in a different way than I was writing at the time. I would say, hi, Sherry Gould, I see you're here. Nice to see you.
A small world.
Yeah.
So Alyssa's asking, I'm definitely interested in sorting this all out. Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee was pivotal book for me.
Me too.
Yeah, me too. Joy says, Willie Winnie for this. I have just ordered your book and I'm very grateful for your
Thanks.
work. Dr. Lori Lambert, who teaches at one of the tribal colleges, she says, I live on an Indian reservation in Montana. The elders still adhere to blood quantum for enrollment. Many
Yeah.
tribal members have married and have had children from all different races. If tribes want to keep their sovereignty, they need to change enrollment practices, at least here in the West.
Can I comment on that?
Yeah, please.
Is that the whole comment?
With a thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. Yes, that's right. You know, I have a very personal story about that. So the White Earth Ojibwe Nation, my nation, which I am a citizen, has used quarter blood quantum for many, many years, right, as the criteria for citizenship, for belonging. And that is a scary prospect. I mean, those blood quantums are made to make us disappear, right? It's bureaucratic extinction. So several years ago, some people might know who Gerald Visner is. He's a really famous Indigenous Ojibwe writer and theorist. He was part of a constitutional convention at White Earth. It also included one of my former graduate students, Jill Dorfler, who was a grad student at the time. We wrote a new constitution that, among other things, got rid of blood quantum and went to lineal descent. And it was overwhelmingly ratified. I think it was 89% by our nation. And guess what has happened to that? The Department of Interior hasn't approved it. So we're stuck. I mean, and it's tied up into all these complex issues around the fact that we're a member of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, which includes 5 other bands. And it's all this bureaucracy, and it's all, you know, I don't know. It's the Bureau of Indian Affairs isn't letting us reckon membership the way we have decided we want to do it, for that exact reason. Who are we? We're kin. That's how we determine where we belong, who belongs to us, and who we belong to. So it's insidious. It is the product of colonialism. We can point to exactly when this kind of calculation started to come into being, and it's eliminatory in very frightening ways. So, and you know, at the other hand, actually, I will go ahead and say tribes have debates over this. So, I mean, that's my answer. Somebody else might have a very different answer, but they're, you know, really contentious issues about what we do about these kinds of structures for determining who belongs and all those kinds of things.
Well, thank you so much for that poignant answer. Yeah, doesn't seem to be a clear-cut way of moving. And I've heard other stories, especially under the Indian Act in Canada.
Yeah. Yes.
Of things like that.
Yep. Yeah. You know, and it's at the bottom line is, you know, Indian sovereignty. Communities have to, in the best of all possible worlds of sovereignty, particular communities decide how they're going to do things, just in general, including how they're going to imagine the future, which we better be thinking about.
Yes, thank you so much for that. And we have about 1 minute left. So I don't know if you have a final message that you would like to leave everyone with. And some people have asked about purchasing your book. I dropped a link into the chat box.
Oh, well, thank you. Yes, the BIA definitely has a reason not to recognize Indigenous peoples, and it is about money. The easiest thing, the best thing for a settler colonial state is for us to disappear. That's what it wants to have happen. I would just want to thank you all for taking time to be here today. I really appreciate it. Thank you for listening and thinking about these things with me. And yeah, I enjoyed my time with you. Miigwech, we say Miigwech. I mean, we're both Algonquian languages, but Miigwech is really different from Winnie.
Yes, it is. And Gitsy Willy Winnie, great thanks to you, Jean, for coming and having this conversation and answering questions. I'm sure people are going to keep on having questions, and questions are good because they make us think. So we also want to thank the audience for attending this critical conversation on firsting and lasting. And I do have to add a little bit of information. So thank you to everyone who helped make this possible. Through donations, we're able to do programs like this. If you would like to make a donation to help us bring more authors here, I'm dropping a link down into the chat box. This has really been a wonderful conversation, and I hope it really gets everybody thinking. And thank you so much once again, Jean,
Ti
for being
miigwech.
here with us.
Ti miigwech.